in the grand scheme of things, when you sign on an academic, a scholar to write a piece for you, uh, what does that pie look like? Is social media a big piece of that pie? Is it direct pitches? You reaching out? How do you meet your authors from this neck of the woods?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think my my colleagues and I have talked about where pitches come from because obviously we're interested in getting more good pitches all the time. We want more ideas to be coming in. We want that funnel of good ideas to be as wide as possible. I would say that if you're talking about a pie, often it comes in thirds. There's three ways we get stories in the Boston Globe's ideas section. Each of these three ways usually amounts to like one third of the stories that we end up running. One is somebody writes to us directly and says, "Hey, I have a pitch. I have this something I want to write for you. I know what you guys do, or I know roughly what a you know a newspaper and digital opinion section look like. Here's a version of that. What do you think?" And we say, "Yeah, that sounds really good. We'll take it. We'll work with you to make the argument a little sharper. But yes, we'll take it." So that's like offer made, offer accepted. Another category is what you and I sort of did, which was that uh, somebody is talking about something. In your case, it was on Twitter, but in other cases, authors of all kinds, but including academic authors, will be mentioning something on Twitter, or they'll be quoted in an article. And we'll say, "Hey, that sounds like an interesting piece for us. Let's talk about that."
Hmm.
And so sometimes, you and I met when you had a very interesting trove of material you want to write about. Jeff said, "Hey, this is great for, say, Boston Globe Ideas." That's sort of magical. But sometimes I have to do a lot more legwork to reach out. Like I will, if it's somebody I follow and they follow me, I'll direct message them and say, "Hey, that tweet of yours was really interesting. Could we develop that into an idea?"
Hmm.
Or I'll email them or call them. We have a piece we're running this week, a technology piece by a business professor at Syracuse. Have subscribed to his email newsletter
Hmm.
for 10 or 15 years. And he wrote something that I thought, the kernel of that could be an idea for us. And I
Hmm.
wrote to him and said, would you be open to revising this for a more general audience? And he did, and it's a good piece for us, and we're going that way.
Hmm.
And then the other one third is kind of a hybrid of the two, where somebody comes to us, they want to write about something, and they say, in maybe like a 6-paragraph summary, kind of where they want to go with it. And we're like, no, I don't think that works. But way down at the bottom, you mentioned almost as an aside,
Hmm.
this other aspect of your research or other, the background for this. That sounds like the story. And so sometimes we will kind of redirect them onto something that interests us, because what we're trying to do is just serve as like a broker between the author and our audience. And sometimes we just have a sense that, like, our audience at this time, relative to other things that have been covered in the news, relative to other things we've been working on, triangulating from these other contexts, we say this is the way to go. So, one third of the time they offer it, it lands. One third of the time we reach out to them, and one third of the time we have to it's a confection.
That makes sense. From I think I would speak on behalf of lots of lots of colleagues to say that the editorial workflow and process is just radically different between, say, journal publishing and university press publishing, and then say publishing in newspapers or digital publications. In the sense, and I personally find this really positive, like where the weight goes on the scale on the side of newspapers and magazines, is a far more recursive, hands-on. I think a term that would be used would be developmental editing rather than a kind of quick structure check or even peer review. And is that something that, in your experience, kind of most academics kind of ramp up on and just sort of come over to? Or is I remember the first time that I went through that, I was excited by it, but it was definitely shocking. It's like, wow, I'm getting track changes back, and
Right.
there are massive blocks and things have been moved around, and by golly, like, it got better. But you would never see that from acquisitions editor or a peer reviewer or a journal editor. What's it like, the psychology of writing, that transition for authors, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so some of it is because of things that are just the author could not know or not control. So, for example, we want to weed out things that are obviously jargon, um, just kind of belaboring the point, in the weeds, whatever. But when I talk about things outside the author's control, in addition to those structural elements I just discussed, it could be that a point is being made that we just made in a piece the previous week. It could be that the factual kind of basis for it is too kind of hard to establish. It could be, there can be any number of reasons that we as editors are just making kind of a judgment call.
Mm.
And most academics I've worked with, my wife's a history professor, so like I'm very aware of the different kind of processes that, usually, her work goes through. Most academic writers I've dealt with totally get it and are fine. I think they're not used to the speed of the turnaround that we often need. But I think almost like the shock to the system makes them extremely, I get edits back from academic authors, revisions, recursions, as you talked about, much more frequently than I do from a lot of journalists that we work with. It's as if they say, oh, I recognize this is, for a timely publication, and I'm so not used to this level of editing. I better like get on it soon. So I find that the transition to this kind of writing and editing seems to go pretty well. Sometimes, you reach I've dealt with a few academics who are stubborn about, insisting on certain phrasing, and then we just have to have more rounds of this recursive process. But at the risk of sounding too kind of haughty about it, like, I mean, we know our audience and we know what lands and what doesn't land. I mean, and I just usually find that our instincts on this stuff is right, and sharing the reason why we're making changes we are, that it's not just arbitrary. It's not because we wouldn't write it that way. Usually sharing the rationale really gets the job done. And just one last thing, especially in my section, in an opinion section, the goal is not to have it become a piece that I, as the editor, or my deputy editor, that we agree with. We're trying to make sure it's making the best possible version of the argument. And so we think of our role very much as like the host at an intellectual cocktail party, where we're going up to other guests at the party and being like, you know what, you should meet Tom. He's got this really interesting, he works on this really interesting stuff about China and freedom of expression in China, and then you're off and running. It doesn't matter if what you're going to say is not something I agree with. I'm just a broker to the audience saying, look, this guy's interesting, hear him out. And so that, I just want to offer that clarification, that we're not trying to hammer it into some sort of like predetermined point of view. That's we're a little bit more ecumenical in that regard.
That makes sense. When cycling back just for a moment to the pie and the thirds, and you had mentioned, one pathway is just a direct contact and so forth. In your experience, what has the makings of of course, a pitch can fall flat for any number of reasons. Things like you said, beyond the author's knowledge, that maybe a week before there was something, pretty comparable or whatever it might be. But, in real concrete terms, maybe first question might be full piece or quick paragraph gist description. And is it take your 50-50, no difference between those two types of pitches? Or is there some genre or mode of pitching that you like to see, just, idiosyncratically? Right. You're like, I prefer this one over that kind.
I mean, there will always be exceptions to this, but there tends to be like a balancing act to this question. The more surprising and counterintuitive and novel an idea is, the more we're likely to say, oh, wow, I'd love to read that, based purely on a pitch. The more it's treading what feels like familiar ground, or is trying to pull off a sort of it's trying to stick the landing of a intellectual move that's a little bit hard to describe without just seeing it, the more we want to actually read the piece. So when you and I met, we had this discussion about all this interesting material you had gathered about underground zines in Mao's China. And it's like, wow, that's surprising. That's interesting. I want to see more. I didn't need to see the piece. You had shown some of the imagery and we're like, oh, that's just really cool. It's just really beautiful. It's really striking. So that was enough. But a lot of times we need to see the piece because it's hard to describe in the abstract some ideas. There are some ideas that there are some pitches that we get that are, by the time someone has articulated the nature of what it is they want to argue, they've actually written most of the piece. And so, given that we're going for surprising, delighting our audience, but challenging them, provoking, getting people to reconsider conventional wisdom, pushing them to reconsider their assumptions, the more, it's okay to send us like hey, I'd like to write something about why this thing that everybody thinks is true is actually wrong, or we're asking the wrong question, or that's time to reconsider this aspect of history, whatever it is.
I feel like one muscle that started to strengthen, I haven't written all that many pieces. I've written maybe 20 pieces, over the course of my career. So it's not as if I have a column, but I can, even with that quantity of writing, I feel like this muscle strengthening in me that has always been there, but until you start writing in this way, it doesn't come up, which is, for lack of a better word, in many of the conversations I've had with editors I've worked with, it's clear that there's this algorithm going, which is how do we take what you're talking about, Tom, and somehow thread it to something that is here and now. So I might be talking about something from the 1950s in my case, or 60s or 20s, or something, that within and of itself is not present perhaps, but how to sort of energetically bring it back to something that may be on the minds of readers. And in the beginning, I felt like all of that intellectual work was being done by my counterpart, at the magazine, at the newspaper. But now suddenly I find myself looking at my own work and seeing those resonant frequencies. Some of them are stretches, some of them seem right on.
Right.
And my sense is, and I'm just, it's sort of a proposition to see what you think of it. I feel like most academics, for whatever our training, we that muscle is pretty weak in us, and there are probably way more stories out there that would be amazing to be pitched that never are, because they're just not thinking in those terms, because they work on medieval Europe or something like that, and they don't realize that there's some stuff going on with, I don't know, alt-right, trolls online, white supremacists who harken back to medieval Europe, and there's something to be written about there. But is that your experience? Do you feel like there's more ideas out there that just never reach your inbox?
Yeah, that's definitely true. Also, it's possible that, so you say that muscle is weak. I mean, I think that's definitely true. The danger is that sometimes people can try to exercise this muscle in a way that is, I guess, to keep the metaphor a stretch. So here's an interesting example. We ran a really interesting piece about the Texas abortion law recently from a classics professor, somebody who studies ancient Rome, because she saw in the kind of vigilante approach of this law that allows anybody to sue someone who performs or abets an abortion. She saw a parallel to something that happened around essentially the fall of the Roman Republic, when society was weakened and people were kind of turned against each other, and that threaded the needle really well. She's like basically thinking, oh God, this is on my mind. This actually reminds me of something I see in my work. That's a good example, although, it's possible to stretch the historical analogy, and some of our readers, the commenters were like, I don't buy it, but that's okay. It was a legitimate thing to discuss and to raise. And it was just interesting to think about, this aspect of life in ancient Rome that most readers wouldn't otherwise have come into contact with. I think the real genius of a lot of these pieces is when the connection to today is made, but it's not like, it's done artfully and without being so obvious. So um it doesn't beat the reader over the head, and it just doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like it's trying too hard.
Mm.
And a lot of that is just like, when you see it. I don't know that I have like a prescription for how to do it. But look, the truth is that like all throughout human history, people have been wrestling with the same questions. Many of the same questions we're wrestling with now. It's very hard for me to believe that somebody in academics they're working on something that has no relevance to today. That just seems impossible, right? And even if the way they explain their work to friends or relatives, surely they sometimes have to resort to analogies in how they even explain their work. And I would think those analogies are kind of the pathways to connect things to today. It does not necessarily have to be something in the news right now. That Texas case I mentioned is maybe obviously a classic example of something that is in the news, but it could be something that's around the corner. It could be something that's as simple as an anniversary. 50 years ago there was this, but it's time to reconsider the way we think about it. Good enough.
Yeah.
It's an art form.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. For some reason, my thoughts turned to Squid Game, where it has a resonant frequency with the present, which made it explode, and people's,
Yeah.
but there's nothing in there that says, "All right, viewers, welcome to our analysis of contemporary, hypercapitalism," or whatever it might be.
Yeah, great example. Right.
Well, that's great. I mean, so how? I guess the last question, because I want to be respectful of your time. How can for those of us who have dipped our toe in this world and really like it, I guess I'm for so many reasons so eternally and professionally grateful to Jeff Wasserstrom. He's a mentor to so many people. I think he might be probably one of the most influential mentors of the modern period. Quietly, it's kind of like one of these people who once kind of like one of these athletes who has anyone ever looked at Jeff's stats? I think he might be the leader in whatever on base percentage or something like this. We just never noticed it. But in any event, ever since he showed me this pathway a number of years ago, and started dipping my toes and really liking this realm, what can those of us who have dipped our toes and gotten something out of this, how can we help like junior colleagues? What advice would you recommend that we give them to say, you might want to check this out? And not only just in an abstract way, you might want to check it out, but like, here's just a very simple 1, 2, 3 step to do it. Jeff handed me like a paragraph of something he wrote. He said, I recommend that you write to the editor, and I recommend that you politely say, I would appreciate, I think the recommendation was, I would appreciate if you could let me know, yay or nay, in the next 72 hours, because otherwise, I'd like to bring it somewhere else. Something like concrete that I never would have thought to do, but which definitely helped in the process because someone said no, but then someone said yes, and I just wouldn't have thought to do it. Just like in concrete terms, what advice should the likes of me give a junior colleague who may actually be perfect for this?
Yeah, a few things. Maybe in reverse order of importance, I'll just start with the last thing you mentioned about just the approach to editors. I mean, I think it's okay to say, look, can you let me know? Probably give people greater than 72 hours, depending on where we are in our publishing cycle. I need usually a week to sometimes even 10 days to fully think through and respond to a query. Sometimes I'll read it and I'll need a second or even third read or discussion with my colleagues to kind of get to a definitive yes or no, to see like which slice of the pie that's in. Is this something we want to accept? Is this something that maybe we need to modify, or pass on altogether? So 72 hours feels quick, but that said, I think it's fair to ask for that level of feedback. One of my biggest pieces of advice is to get across that for this kind of writing, there's really only room to convey one idea. And then get off stage. Like I've had people submit 1,200 words where like the reader really got it after 900, and the last 300 were really embroidering the point, crediting other researchers who have kind of gotten there earlier with aspects of this, having a few asides and, oh, by the ways, it's like, if the reader has it by 900 words, to get to 1200, 1500 words, there has to be really like a second gear or some kind of narrative approach, something that goes beyond what we're, I think, usually talking about here, which is something more of an ideas or an op-ed kind of piece. So, but that idea that like you have one thing to convey to the reader and then you're going to get off stage, like that can be clarifying. It can be maybe a little daunting. Not a lot of ideas can be kind of shoehorned into that format, but most can. And so that might be a good kind of yes, no. Like, does this require, all kinds of loading up the reader with background knowledge that they don't already have? I think it's okay to have to bring the reader along on, say, something that happened in history or whatever, but it can't feel like homework. And they have to be made to care and made to feel smart enough that they can engage with the material. So, I like to think of like the readers are smart, but they don't know anything about what's in front of them until like, the piece takes them by the hand and shows them, look, here's what I'm talking about. So that balance of like respecting readers' intelligence, but also taking the time to patiently explain something, like that uses up a big chunk of, getting to 800 or 1,000 words. So this is all a way of saying that like the idea that you're hoping to land can't be excessively nuanced or complicated. It has to be something that, we could write a headline around and get people to read. Because at the end of the day, we want them to read it, right?
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much for taking out time for me. And I feel like I have a better sense also of what might be next in terms of what matches that that criteria, which I think is great. I have this like open mic night idea of, you got a song, you get on the stage, you sing a song, you get off. If you don't want to say, oh, and then in this part, the strings are coming, but you have to hear it. It's like, wait a minute, sing the song, or
Yep.
either the song can be sung during open mic night, or maybe wait until it's ready to sing.
Yeah, I think that's
But
exactly right. Yeah.
well, thanks so much, and I hope that I have another idea that I could send your way at some point. Right now, my brain is perpetually sleep deprived, but at some point, I think ideas will return to it, and I hope that we cross paths again.
Me too. Thanks, Tom.
Cool. See you later.